Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Rohit Mehta to talk about grants. Rohit, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Alex.
So, for people hearing you for the very first time, I was wondering if you could share your superhero origin story.
Sure. So I got started with the nonprofit and charitable sector very young. I remember being in school, maybe grade six, and I wanted to win the Hoops for Heart prizes that were being offered for fundraising. So I started going door to door and asking for donations for the Heart and Stroke Foundation. And I was very competitive, so I did win some prizes. And I learned about door to door fundraising. And then fast forward to doing a few of those. When I was in high school, I started getting involved with various community groups, school clubs. Any given night, I had three different clubs to go to at the same time. So I was very interested in that line of work. Just as a volunteer, I was Mississauga's youngest volunteer of the year at age 16. And then I went on to start some organizations, one in environmental work, another in getting young people to volunteer. So it became pretty obvious to my family that this was something that I was very interested in. And I started to learn that there was a nonprofit sector where you could actually make this your career. And so after going to university, I started working for a food bank right away. And, it was so cool to have met so many people doing good work. And then I guess that energy led to me being appointed to the Ontario Trillium Foundation, which is the largest funder of nonprofit community organizations in the country. And so, again, I think I was possibly the youngest person ever to be appointed to the jury. And so that's a funding body that's getting to sit behind the funding table and make decisions. And I didn't really know what I was getting into, but man, was it a good opportunity and an eye opener for how funding works. And that probably laid some of the foundations for what I do today.
Awesome. That's really cool. Awesome story. Thank you for sharing that. And then more recently, you've started a company called Do Good Funding. Can you talk a bit about that? Why did you decide to start something like this?
Yeah, Alex, I met a lot of folks who are doing good work. I mentioned that I started an organization to help young people volunteer. It was really a response to young people who needed community service hours. So I met a few dozen organizations, and then I was doing work with environmental nonprofits as a young person. Again, a lot of networking, a lot of meeting organizations, and then on the funding side, I got to have site visits with those organizations, meet the leaders, review their funding application, and I kept seeing the same challenge again and again. People who wanted to do good couldn't because they were struggling with funds. It was the biggest challenge. It was keeping executive directors up at night. Literally, funding and fundraising was the biggest issue that consistently was faced by executive directors of charities, nonprofits across the board. And the more I looked into it, I realized that grant writers were almost aggressively taking a percentage of their fees, the fees that these organizations received or the funds that they received. They were almost aggressively being taken away by grant writers when they would apply for a grant. And so this combination of awareness about nonprofits and charities and all of their struggles, and then this eye towards the fundraising profession and how grant writers would take heavy fees, it caused me to start thinking about what I could do to have more of an impact. And I think in the early days of me working for various nonprofits, it became pretty obvious to me that if I was going to make a big difference, I was going to have to start something that nobody else was doing, and to build something that would enable those organizations to do good. And so in 2018, I started writing the business plan for Do Good. Many folks in my network had suggested to me I might want to start a business. They told me I had a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience. Rohit, you should start a business. And I didn't have a lot of faith in myself because I had never run a business before. I didn't have a business background or training. But I went to my local entrepreneur center and I got help at the Brampton Entrepreneur Center. And yeah, started that business in 2019, and it's been going ever since. 7 years of business.
Awesome. I'm curious, what is the typical rate these days for a grant writer? Like when you talk about large fees, I imagine it's a percentage based.
Yeah. And they are taking on average 5 to 10% of the grant, which for $100,000 grant, that's a lot of money. That's $5 to $10,000. It borders on the line of unethical because the money is really intended for the recipients of that funding, which is the organization itself. And most importantly, it's actually intended for their clients. So when a grant writer takes 10% of the grant, they're actually taking money away from the clients of that organization. And I think for that reason, it's so important that there are alternatives like what we're doing at Do Good.
I'm just going to play devil's advocate for 1 second because this is also new for me. How would you see a fair way of grant writers getting compensated?
Has to be an hourly rate. It has to be an hourly rate that says the amount of work they're putting in is exchanged for a fixed amount of money that is transparent. Because whether a grant is successful or not should not determine how much to pay the person who did the work. It's a lot of work, right? Like we have years of knowledge collectively. My team can tell you how to have a successful grant. They can tell you about the past mistakes people have made. They can tell you about the type of language you need to use. They can talk about structure, strategy, budget, process. This is it's a profession, right? And so what a lot of grant writers do is they work on contingency. Somehow they do the work for free. And that's probably just a huge risk that they're taking. And then when the grant is successful, they take an exorbitant amount of that money. I think the best way to do it is an hourly rate, fair and transparent. Here's how many hours I worked for. Here's what we charge. Everybody gets charged the same amount.
So then what's the approach that Do Good Funding takes in this context? How do you help circumvent, get around these grant writers that take so much?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's interesting about our business, Alex, is that we keep things honest and transparent. And so we charge an hourly rate. Everybody gets the same rate as long as they're a registered nonprofit or charity. And we don't advertise heavily. We don't spend money. You'll never see us on a transit ad or a billboard up to today. And the reason why is because the word of mouth that spreads from our work is so powerful that we have lots of work as a result. We've received referrals every week since 2023. And I think that what makes us different in this approach is that we say we don't want to take a massive chunk of an organization's grant. We would rather work with them over a number of grants, right? And I think that this approach is a good one because an organization that works with a writer or with a professional, there's a relationship that forms. You get to know each other. You can work faster, better, smarter, and that actually causes fees to go down over time. And I think that that's a better approach than somebody paying a grant writer a lot of money. Maybe that grant writer has written a grant for them once, maybe twice, but it's not a sustainable model.
Let's zoom out here for a second and talk about grant writing in general and grants in general. A lot of turmoil in the world today, this being May 2025. I'm curious if you can give us, your impression of how, what are grants like in this day and age? Is it easier than before? Is it more difficult than before? Is it more complicated? Like what, if you could just paint a, picture for us.
Yeah. Today in Canada in May, right after a federal election, right after a provincial election, in the middle of a tariff war, when AI is constantly in a state of flux, it's hard. It's hard because the economy is bad right now. So corporations are giving less, they're sponsoring less, and they're giving less contributions. People are strapped, right? So they're donating less and they're giving less of their funds to charities and nonprofits. And therefore, the organizations have less money. So the need has increased and the funding that's out there has decreased. A new federal government was just elected within the last 2 weeks, and they will not be granting actively for at least a few months. They're getting organized, they're getting set up, they're getting their cabinet together, and as a result, they won't have mandates to grant. Some of these ministries won't even exist That puts a lot of pressure on the charities and nonprofits that rely on funding that they expect at this time of year. So it is a difficult time for organizations from all fronts, and they are more cash strapped than ever. Maybe COVID times were a little bit more challenging, but this is pretty rough.
Yeah, a lot of moving parts, and I definitely see on my side too the fewer people donating. But I've heard and I've had a guest on in the past that says something about the people who are continuing to donate seem to be donating more. And I'm not sure if that balances out the fact that less or fewer people are donating. But I'm curious to know if you have a perspective on that. Was that maybe true back then, but not so true now? How are people? Because people are a bit concerned about the economy in many different ways, and it makes sense for them to then decrease their donations. What have you seen in the per donor aspect?
I mean, we don't look at a lot of donor data. I wouldn't say that I
Mm.
have a lot of knowledge on donor trends, but what I can tell you is that there's a bigger gap between the rich and the poor today than ever. And so, if people are wealthy or if they have the means, giving to charities, you probably know it reduces their taxable income, right? And so, to me, it's no surprise that as AI takes off and certain people hold that wealth in I guess, in a way that's not as equal. They may be making more money. Certain folks may be better off right now in this economy. There's still a lot of work from home going around. There's quite a few cost savings there. And for those who are in certain lines of business, it's possible that they may have the means to give more. That's awesome. Generally, as a whole, I would say generally donations have gone down. Less people are signing up to give. And, I work with a lot of business owners within a co-working space. All of them say that revenues this year have been actually really low. And the tariff war definitely impacts that, that there's less of a capacity to give and less of an interest in giving in an economy that's very unstable and hard to project, hard to predict. So I would say, it's possible that some donors may increase their giving, but sometimes there's reasons behind that. And some of those are actually tax breaks.
So, given the conditions that we're in, what impacts are you seeing? So, you said, I mean, we talked about corporations giving less, people donating less, no government grants, at least in Canada for a few months. Are there any other risks that you see as a result of everything that we're seeing in the world today?
Yeah, I'd say that the number of applications that are going into funders has gone up. Absolutely. With the advent of AI, what it allows folks to do is people who didn't have comfort or familiarity or interest in grant writing can now throw some stuff into an AI and they can get a rough draft. And some people are submitting these. And so it's getting easier and easier to apply last minute for a grant, whereas folks couldn't do that before. And although their chance of success won't be very high, the number of applications going in is higher. I don't have data to back that up, but that's my observation.
So, less money, more applications, more competition.
Yeah.
What is a nonprofit to do if they're hoping to get some grant money?
Probably hire a professional, probably hire somebody who can help them navigate this crazy storm, whether that be a prospect researcher, a grant writer, someone to help them with strategy, someone to guide them on program planning. Like, there's a whole profession out there of folks who specialize in this. We're not the only company, of course. And I think it's super important to know your strengths. And if there's an area where your organization doesn't have the strengths, get out there and hire a vendor. Put out a request for proposal, see who's willing to do it at a great rate, and hire the help to get through the storm.
So the idea would be to make sure that each of your applications is the highest quality that you can produce to increase the chances of you actually being able to get that grant. Is that
I mean, I think that's one part of it. So making sure that you have high quality applications is great. I think that you need to have a strong strategy. So funders these days want organizations to have a clear strategy, maybe a strategic plan. They know where they're going. Um, it's also important that you're approaching the right funder. We get contacted sometimes by folks, they want to apply for something and they're not qualified or they're not eligible, right? So that prospect research piece is critical to say, have you spent enough time looking at the linkage and the affinity and the interest between that funder and your organization? Linkage. Are they actually connected to your cause? do they care about your work? Affinity, you know, do they have the means? Do they have the funding to actually give you what you need? Do they have money in the bank? And interest. Is this an area where they actually fund? Can you go on their website, on their annual report, and see that there's an interest in funding this particular area? If not, it may not be a good fit. And for the organizations who try to apply anyway, that can be challenging if you have a great proposal and they're not interested, or they don't have enough money to fund your organization, then it's not going to work. And then the other thing, of course, is these days organizations need to have a strong website. You need to have a social media presence. Many funders want audited financial statements. All these things require work that even if you have a great grant, if you don't have those pieces, it's going to be difficult to be approved.
Hey, Alex here. I want to take a brief moment and thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode so far, please consider sharing it with someone who would also benefit from its insights. It's these kinds of referrals that really help the show grow. You can also show your support by making a small donation. I don't do corporate sponsorships or product placements, so I rely on your support to keep the show going. You can visit my website, agentsofprofit.com, and click Support Us from the top menu. Thank you kindly. .com and click Support Us from the top menu. Thank you kindly. That's actually interesting. So it's not just the grant application itself, but there seems to be, you're suggesting there's supportive elements that nonprofits should have in place, like the website, like social media, that will strengthen their application. I was wondering if you could spend a bit more time on that. Like, what, besides from applying for the grant to the right people, right, that have the alignment and the interest, what auxiliary or adjacent type of things should they consider to make sure that they have the best chance of winning that grant?
Right. You definitely need to make sure that you have a presence. So funders, especially corporations, look for an online presence, and they're looking on your social media to see, what are you posting? Are you posting events and initiatives? Is your social media active? That's a really good sign, because those corporate supporters probably want to sell their goods and services. For foundations, they're going to look at your website. They're going to look at your About Us section. They're going to look at what your organization stands for. And they're especially interested in your financials. So are the funds being managed well? And is there transparency? If your financials are audited and they're posted on your website, that's a very good sign from a foundation, because they can trust you. Other things that folks look for, a strategic plan is fantastic. And a strategic plan is fantastic because it directs the organization's strategy and it helps them clearly know where they're headed so they can give confidence to others. It shows that they've done the homework to develop a strong strategy. An operating budget is another one. So funders don't want organizations that are operating in the dark. They want you to have planned expenses, and they want to see that. And that goes hand in hand with program plans, right? They want to know that there's a plan for each program. They ask very specific questions on a grant. And if you have a program plan, you can then easily answer those questions. It becomes obvious, again, that you've done the homework, you've done the planning, and you're organized. And funders want to fund folks who are organized.
These are great strategies. Thank you so much for sharing them. I'm curious to know if there's something specific about the grant writing itself. Like you talked about AI writing sometimes drafts, which I've heard of many times before. Hopefully they're not submitting them as just AI written and they're actually doing editing and making sure the tone and personality is there. But is there anything that you can add to making sure that the written proposal is of the best quality or the best, most likely chance, or highest chance of success?
I think there's some obvious pieces, like they have to be reviewed. I can't tell you as a grant reviewer how many times I reviewed a grant with the Ontario Trillium Foundation, with the Ministry of Children and Youth Opportunities Fund. I would review grants with spelling errors, structural errors. There were a handful of grants you couldn't even understand sometimes what the person was trying to say. And I think that happens from rushing and submitting things at the last minute. And so that review process is very important. The other thing is that the project has to be realistic and achievable within a certain time frame. You have to have realistic milestones and realistic goals, and has to be something you can achieve with that amount of money within the time frame, usually 1 year that a funder is funding. And so I think definitely the grammar check is important. The timeline check and making sure that you've asked for sufficient resources is important. And then the budget has to speak to the narrative as well. So when I do grant reviews, sometimes I find that people have written something in the budget, but it's nowhere to be seen in the grant narrative, or vice versa. And so there has to be alignment. And as funders, we're sitting there with our clipboards and our rubric, we're assessing, does the budget speak to the narrative? They said they're going to do something. Is there a cost allocated to that? If somebody says they're going to hire a staff and there's no staff member in the budget, well, sometimes that can be a challenge. The other thing is funders don't want to fund 100% of a project. It's too risky for a funder to fund the entire project. So they look for folks who are, I guess, diversifying their revenues and bringing in additional sources of revenue so that the funder is not on the line for the entire cost.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. Thank you for sharing that. Any other preparations that like outside of the grant writing? I imagine there's a lot of research to find the grants to begin with, making sure, like we said earlier, that the right fundraiser is approached. Are there any other, and your website's in place and your social media is in place, are there any other just things to consider in terms of the whole process that would basically, like any other preparation before the grant is actually submitted to a fundraiser?
Yeah, I mean, step one, which I didn't go into in depth, is prospect research. And that's the careful act of finding funding opportunities that are a good fit and that the organization is actually eligible for. We have something that we built ourselves. It's called Do Good Grants. And why we did that is because it can sometimes be hard for organizations to find an opportunity to fund their work. And so we got so many requests for this, and we just built it ourselves. And we find that it's so helpful for folks to have a place where they can go to look up opportunities and then figure out if it's a good fit. So that's sort of step one. Find the opportunities, do that prospect research. And then the next step is to actually figure out the guidelines of that funding opportunity and to read them from end to end. It could be 15 pages, 20 pages of text. I think it's very important to review those. And it's very important to get a clear sense of, well, what is the funder looking for exactly? What's the fine print? Is there anything in here that would deem us ineligible? Because it's a more effective use of your time if you just focus on the grants that you're eligible for. And sometimes folks want to apply for a grant that they're clearly not eligible for, and they just want to see what happens. And I think the strategy has to be to just focus on the grants that the organization can actually receive, is eligible to receive, and to really direct all resources into those grants.
So better to focus on the ones you have a chance to winning versus the spray and pray and just see what happens as a result of, because I imagine too, it would also flood the market with ineligible grants. And this makes the grant provider, the fundraiser, that much, like they'd have to consume more resources and take more time to be able to go through this and then start filtering out the ones that don't actually aren't eligible or aren't relevant, which frustrates, I'm sure, everybody. So,
and it's just going to increase now with AI.
Right.
Because the challenge with AI, and we play with it a lot at work just to experiment with it and see how it works. And, we need to know this technology as grant writers because it is taking over all aspects of business. As more folks use AI, the text looks great. The sentences look well structured. At first glance, it seems awesome. But then you start to read it and you realize, okay, there's certain sentences here that have no meaning or no substance, or perhaps the wording that's used is so incorrect that it's actually not making sense anymore. So now the grant managers have to spend even more time and more resources reviewing those grants because some folks are submitting whatever the AI spits out. And so it's like a word of caution. Maybe don't use AI on grants, let alone the consequences for climate change and the environment, which is a whole other discussion. I think the key thing here is if you write a grant yourself and you have it reviewed by your colleagues, by your peers, and it's eligible, it's a great fit, it's a great project, there's lots of alignment, you're way more likely to be successful than someone who throws a grant in an AI spits it out and tries to submit it. Those aren't going to be successful. And if maybe there's like a 2 or 3% chance that it is successful, maybe let's say even a 1 to 3% chance that something could go through, it might be hard to deliver on that. It might be hard to deliver on a grant that an AI wrote because it may write in some things that aren't relevant or that the organization can't successfully do.
Let's go a bit further into AI because I'm always curious about that. And I have heard of many situations where grant writers use AI to do that first draft we spoke about and then do the edits because some of the stuff that AI generates the first time around is so generic and so bland and so just not garbage, but just there's nothing, there's no emotion there, there's no
Yeah.
feeling there, there's no so you're cautioning, or at least yeah, I believe you're cautioning organizations to use AI to do even a first draft. But is there any other element of AI that can help toward this grant writing? Is it helping do more research or help you with your social media or your website? Like in terms of AI in general, how can it how can it play a positive impact, positive role applying for grants?
Sure, there are aspects. So, for instance, when I'm writing a grant, there have been times, very rarely, where I have a bunch of bullets. I usually start my narrative with bullet points, and I recall a time last year. There was a really short deadline. We were tight on time, and I had about 6 or 7 bullet points, and I wanted to turn it into a paragraph. And in the interest of time, I asked the AI to use bridging words to take my thoughts and my concept and to turn it into a paragraph. And I said specifically, do not change the concept, do not change the ideas, just use adjectives and bridging words to turn it into a paragraph. It worked. Um, Social media, there's no point of designing things from scratch in a rudimentary graphic design system if you can use AI to enhance. So everything from Canva to all of its competitors, they do allow for some AI usage, and it can be helpful, right? Even the fact that you're using the search box to look up an element to put into your design, that's AI as well, right? Like it's going to be suggesting similar images or similar elements. And so I would suggest using that to improve social media. Um, Websites, all the major website builders, Wix and all their competitors, they all use AI now. And it allows you to do what you could have done in weeks. You can do it in a few hours now. So I highly encourage folks to use those tools to improve the optics of how the organization looks in the eyes of the funder. Because they will be checking your social media and they will be checking your website. But when it comes to the writing, maybe you can put your writing in an AI and ask it to look for errors or to look for inconsistencies, and then it can be used that way. That could be a helpful tool. But I do caution folks from creating or inventing answers in AI. That's probably the big red flag that I've observed.
One of the comments you've made so far about the things you should do, a couple of things you shouldn't do, but I'm curious to know if there's additional mistakes that you commonly see organizations make when they're applying for grants.
Oh yeah, I mean, not having a sense of urgency is a huge one. So if there's no urgency, your project could run at any time. There's no statistics, there's no research, there's no data. Then the funder is going to prioritize other projects, right? Responding to a community need. So is your program or initiative actually responding to a real need that is taking place? Or is this just something that you decided one day that people from this community need this support? They need notebooks, for example, to improve their literacy, for example, right? Like, is there any data to back that up? Did you do any research, right? Whether it's firsthand research or maybe you're reviewing some research. Considering risks is an important one that folks should make sure they do. Most funders will give you a spot to write about risk management or what do you think will go wrong. And so you should fill that in and say, look, our festival or our event has this risk. Our program or project can have these risks. Here's what we're going to do to mitigate, right? And then some folks make the mistake of asking for 100% funding. I mentioned that before. You need to show other sources of revenue, even if the organization itself is putting in $1,000, even if a sponsor is putting in $1,000. That's still something. right? It's important not to ask the funder to fund 100%. It's too much.
So given all this, if there's, if you had a crystal ball or a superpower and you could predict the future or you would like to make a change to how things are being done in the short term, what would you say to that? How would you either project things to happen in the near future, like where are trends going? If money is going down, grants are going up. All right, well, if money is going down, funders are going down, but grant applications are going up, or if you had some kind of superpower to be able to change something in the world today related to grants, you can answer either of those questions. What would it be?
Right. Well, I think one of the trends is obviously that AI is being used more in grant writing. So what I predict is in the next 2 years, a lot of funders will implement some mechanisms that will figure out if AI has been used to write the grant. And if it is the case that somebody copy and pasted something from an AI and applied, their grant will be declined. I predict that that'll be the case because it wastes the reviewer's time and it's costly for these funding institutions to hire people or to even have community-based grant reviewers like what I did for no pay to review their grants. I don't think it's a good use of anyone's time, so I think that those will be auto declined. What I see happening in the next up to 5 years from now is that grant applications will be very similar to job applications in the sense that you upload something to a website like LinkedIn and you press submit. And with LinkedIn jobs, what it does is it takes keywords from your resume and it uses AI to match it to keywords from the job posting. And if there's a strong match, that employer will contact you because the system will show them there's a strong match. Funders will do the same thing. You don't have to enter in significant amounts of information about your organization. You just enter in your website, maybe provide a link or two to your social media, and press a button. And that will be the application process. No more filling out pages and pages of applications, working on extensive budgets. Funders will look for the organizations that have the strongest match, and then they'll probably do some due diligence and then issue the funds. I think grant applications will actually eventually become a thing of the past because AI can be used by funding institutions to save a lot of time. They just want to know which organization is a fit. They really don't care whether you're spending $100 on your webcam or $200. At the end of the day, they want to fund good work, and they're going to find a more efficient way to do that without people having to waste too much time applying for things. And so for me as a grant writer, that means the industry is changing and our company may not be relevant. That's fine. We do training, we do teaching, we help do research, we help connect organizations to the types of resources they need. And that's called capacity building, right? To give people the skills and the knowledge and the resources they need to do well. And so I think that's where things are going to shift. If grant applications become a thing of the past, or they only require pressing one or two buttons, then folks spend more time self-developing their organizations, improving their strategies, building strong internal capability, and maybe they focus less on funders who would be easy to achieve and more on donors and individuals that will always require that relationship, and the warm connection that the AI is sometimes not able to do.
It sounds like that future prediction is a combination, like you said, of LinkedIn job applications, but also matchmaking.
Yeah,
What
that's the
percent
word.
compatibility are you? And that's cute. And I think that's actually a great idea because it does seem very intense, labor intensive and time intensive to do these things. And it's something as simple as an application with a few relevant fields and keywords and would be a lot easier on both sides. It would save everybody a lot more time to actually focus on using those funds as opposed to the long effort that it takes today.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we would love to be in a position where funders would come to us and say, "Hey, why don't you recommend some organizations who are doing good, and we'll fund them." Like that would be a great place to be. But I think where things are headed is that organizations themselves have to put out their best foot and show themselves as active and engaging online. They have to have a strong online presence, and they have to attract those funders. And and this happens very rarely right now that a funder will reach out to an organization unsolicited and have a conversation and say, hey, we might want to support you. That's where things have to go. They have to go in a direction where organizations are really being their own ambassadors and promoting the work they're doing. Faced with so much competition, they have to find a way to stand out. And then they're going to get more support from individuals. They're going to get more support from corporations, foundations, and even government. And, we didn't touch a lot on social finance and impact investing and that sort of thing. But that is another emerging area where institutions and individuals sometimes pay for outcomes that are achieved by charities and nonprofits. And sometimes it can even result in a return on investment for those investors.
Cool. And I'm also curious about my second question. If you had a superpower that could change something about the world of grant making today, what would it be?
Well, I think it's very impersonal, right? So being someone who's done, let's say, 50 site visits to various organizations, with my Ontario Trillium Foundation days, I was surprised to find that the organizations whose application was weak on paper often presented very well in person, and we were very moved by the work that they did once we got to know them. On the other hand, some site visits were a disaster. And what I experienced as a reviewer was that whereas the application looked very good on paper, sometimes it wasn't much in person, and sometimes it was being presented as a lot bigger on paper than reality. And so, that superpower would be the ability to somehow create those relationships between the funder and the grantee, maybe that they could read each other's minds, and that the funder could almost see, just like in a Marvel movie, I guess, they can see, they tap hands or something and they can see what's happening in the other person's mind and the real impact they're making, the life-changing, life-saving impact that some charities are making. I call these impact organizations. And that folks through this superpower would know that funders can see who's an impact organization and who's not. And so it would help to level the playing field a little bit, where sometimes the little guys who are making a big difference and doing really good work, they would get seen and funded. Whereas the way it works today is the bigger the organization, the more staff, the more resources, often they're the ones who get funded.
I love it. Great superpower. Hope you, well, I can't say hope you get it one day, but I hope something of that essence comes into fruition one day.
Thank you.
Rohit, this has been great. Lots of awesome details and information. There might be some people who have some additional follow-up questions. How they get in touch with you? And is there anything about the Do Good Funding organization you'd like to share with people?
Yeah, it's info@dogoodfunding.ca. And I think that organizations should seek out support. If you found this podcast helpful, please reach out and we can ask for an introduction to us and the work we do. And I encourage folks to listen to the Agents of Nonprofit podcast, because it offers a lot of helpful insights for folks who want to do good work and who want to grow their impact. And so this is a great resource to access. Capacity building institutions like Do Good are great resources that are there to help. And I think if folks spend more time building their internal capacity as leaders of nonprofits, as executive directors, we can put our best foot forward, and then funders will be able to have this insight into who is an impact organization, who's making a difference. And so we almost get closer to that superpower if we just put ourselves in the best light. So thank you, Alex, for the opportunity.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much for doing what you do. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Right on.
All right. That's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.